Well, the history of Melbourne is usually told as a story about how hardy entrepreneurial settlers established a great city against the odds. But a new book has been praised for challenging some of these assumptions and explains how Melbourne was actually settled illegally in opposition to the wishes of the colonial authorities in London. Hamish Fitzsimmons reports.
Like a lot of Australian fortunes, the early wealth of Melbourne was built on property speculation. The Port Phillip district was settled by investors from Van Diemen's Land, who, in defiance of the colonial authorities in London, broke the law to settle here.
In 1835, when Melbourne was founded, the British government's policy was quite clear and the law was quite clear, that any Europeans settling outside defined limits of location were to be considered trespassers on Crown land. They were breaking the law.
In his new book about Melbourne's first years, historian James Boyce points out the settlement of modern-day Melbourne prompted a political crisis in London, which led to a change of colonial policy in 1836. He says it was this that set the scene for the conquest of the southeast of the continent.
And the speed of expansion is unparalleled. In just a few years, we have more land occupied than in the 50 years before, and within 15 years, most of the grasslands of eastern Australia are settled.
The work has attracted the attention of at least one of Australia's lawmakers. Malcolm Turnbull says the book is the sort of magisterial history needed in Australia.
The interesting thing about Melbourne was that it started off wealthy. The foundation of the colony at Sydney Cove was a struggle for many years. Melbourne started off prosperous because the settlers took over the pastures created by the fire stick farming techniques of the Aborigines, just as they had done in Tasmania. And that was really what drove the move to Port Phillip.
But by the 1850s, the mania striking the colony would be the desire for gold. While Melbourne has long seen itself as founded by free men and free enterprise, James Boyce says that story was written in the 1860s after the gold rush made it one of the wealthiest cities in the world.
I think after the gold rushes, marvellous Melbourne wanted to tell a certain story about itself, and that story was that here it was free enterprise in defiance of government creating wealth and prosperity. The story I tell is that in fact it was overwhelmingly former convicts who were the first residents of Melbourne.
John Batman was the driving force behind settling the Port Phillip district and signed a treaty with the Indigenous Kulin people for their lands. James Boyce says Batman had to act quickly because he knew he was dying of syphilis.
Batman is a very critical person in Melbourne's story because of that. He was the one prepared to take the plunge. And he also knew an awful lot about dealing with Aboriginal people and dealing with the land. He was an unusual landowner, son of a convict himself, who'd grown up with a lot of Aboriginal people, knew about how to survive in the bush.
Indeed, John Batman wanted to name the city after himself, one of many possible names that didn't catch on.
I do wonder, would Melbourne be different if the original name had been used instead of Melbourne? After all, the settlement was originally going to be called Batmania. Now, this would mean that the respectable and sometimes staid Melburnians would nowadays be Batmaniacs. Would Melbourne be different if it was inhabited by Batmaniacs instead of Melburnians?
The book also discusses how the rapid speed of the settlement brought disease and violence and had disastrous consequences for the Kulin people.
By 1850, just 15 years of the first settlement, 80% of what had been the most densely populated part of Australia, the population had died.
And that's a legacy Australia still grapples with. Hamish Fitzsimmons, Lateline.